So this is the masthead of William Lloyd Garrison's original abolitionist newspaper, but it's colorized because it's the Liberator dot today. We are considering two dreams that Chief Plenty Coups of the Crow Nation had when he was but a boy, ages 9 and 10. In these dreams, philosopher Jonathan Lear finds for us today a blueprint for radical hope. Lear spends much more time with Plenty Coups' second dream, the one that only the elders could interpret, the one meant for the whole tribe, the one that held out hope for a future goodness which transcended the Crow Nation's ability to understand it. My name is Lowell Bliss. Welcome to episode 39 of the Liberator Today's video series on hope. Jonathan Lear writes, quote, "The first dream was a response to a traditional form of loss, the death of a loved one in a battle against a traditional enemy. And yet the legacy of the dream was to embed in Plenty Coups an authoritative voice that said he had the skills to face up to the future and flourish. We might wonder whether this first dream gave him the courage to have the second one. For in the second dream, he imagines a future that is radically malign, and still he will have the ability to face it well and survive." Unquote. The concepts of hope and courage are often linked. Indeed, Lear gives a whole chapter to the connection. Courage seems to be that virtue which one exhibits when one acts on that bold conviction about that alternative possibility for the future, walks out into that unknown future. Lear writes, "It seems to me arguable that in the second dream, Plenty Coups was beginning to face up to a reality that at this point in history, in his development, he could not face in any other way. Although the dream is, of course, dreamlike, it has a disturbingly realistic tone. It is far from being purely wishful. It predicts a destruction of a way of life. It sees some powerful and malevolent forces that cannot be contained. Indeed, the dream is about facing up to destructive forces that none of the Indian tribes will be able to control." So let's jump into the second dream. There's no personal incident which predicates this second dream. Indeed, all the young boys were sent out by the elders. "There are high peaks in these mountains, O young men. Go to them and dream," the crier said. "Are you afraid of a little suffering? Go into these mountains and find helpers for yourselves and for your people who have so many enemies." Unquote. The 10-year-old Plenty Coups is at first unsuccessful, but then he dreams. He's introduced to a buffalo bull which turns into a man-person. He follows him out onto the plain where the man-person begins to sink slowly into the ground. The first two phrases that the man-person says to Plenty Coups are, "Follow me," and "Be not afraid." These phrases seem to me to be elusive of what Jesus first said to his disciples, "Follow me, and do not be afraid." Let out of the hole in the ground, Plenty Coups is commanded to sit on top of a knoll. Quote, "Then the man-person shook his rattle and sang a queer song 4 times. Look," he pointed. Quote, "Out of the hole in the ground came the buffalo, bulls and cows and calves without number. They spread wide and blackened the plains. Everywhere I looked," Plenty Coups says, "great herds of buffalo were going in every direction, and still others without number were pouring out of the hole in the ground to travel on the wide plains. When at last they ceased coming out of the hole in the ground, all were gone. All. There was not one in sight anywhere, even out on the plains. I saw a few antelope on a hillside, but no buffalo, not a bull, not a cow, not one calf was anywhere on the plains." Plenty Coups continues to recount his second dream. "I turned to look at the man-person beside me. He shook his red rattle again. Look," he pointed. "Out of the hole in the ground came bulls and cows and calves past counting. These, like the others, scattered and spread on the plains. But they stopped in small bands and began to eat the grass. Many lay down, not as a buffalo does, but differently. And many were spotted. Hardly any two were alike in color or size. And the bulls bellowed differently too. not deep and far, sounding like the bulls of the buffalo, but sharper and yet weaker in my ears. Their tails were different, longer, and nearly brushed the ground. They were not buffalo. These very strange animals were from another world. The man-person asks Plenty-Coups if he understands what he has been shown. No, Plenty-Coups answers, and explains, quote, how could he expect me to understand such a thing when I was not yet 10 years old? Later, when the boy recounts his dream vision to the elders in the lodge, Yellow Bear, whom Plenty-Coups calls the wisest man in the lodge, speaks, quote, he has been told that in his lifetime the buffalo will go away forever, and that in their place on the plains will come the bulls and the cows and the calves of the white men. I have myself seen these spotted buffalo drawing loads of the white man's goods, and once at the big fort above the mouth of the Elk River on the Big River, the Missouri. Yellow Bear says, I saw cows and calves of the same tribe as the bulls that drew the loads, unquote. Yellow Bear had the experience, the history, we might say, to know how to interpret this part of the dream. And so do you and I. We know the history. The buffalo were plentiful, and then they were gone. We know what those spotted, domestic, weaker creatures were the moment we heard it. We know the difference between an American bison and a Hereford steer. Heck, we even know what a steer is as compared to the uncastrated bulls of Plenty-Coups' experience. Yellow Bear goes on to make his interpretation explicit. Quote, the dream of Plenty-Coups means that the white men will take and hold this country, and their spotted buffalo will cover the plains. Unquote. We know about animal husbandry. It's not so bad. Swap out one way of life for another, a way of life that we white men have proven generally works, that produces more protein at lesser risk for fewer personal calories expended. Animal husbandry requires less horses and less temptation to steal them from neighboring tribes. Cattle don't roam abroad like bison, and thus less territorial pressure. We can envision an end of the endless wars of the Crows against the Sioux. We are quick to construct a future of goodness for the Crow, but there really is no way we can enter into Plenty-Coups and Yellow Bear's experience except imaginatively. Listen to Plenty-Coups' immediate response. Quote, these strange animals from another world, I was frightened, and I turned to the man-person who only shook his red rattle, but did not sing. Plenty-Coups was afraid. It's hard to understand his fear. We can maybe try to enter this vision through contemplating some modern analogies. Just this past week, the Kansas Leadership Center's Journal published a brilliant issue about the Ogallala Aquifer. Groundwater once covered the Great Plains like buffalo on the prairie. But now we can project out when it will be gone, the water. Doing dryland farming, relinquishing corn to the wetter regions, accepting lower yields and lower income, maybe being forced to relinquish the family farm altogether and moving into towns like Hayes or Salina. For some multi-generational farmers and ranchers in western Kansas, the prospect of such a change is frightening. Often at the Kansas Leadership Center programs, you will hear this saying, people are not afraid of change. They are afraid of loss. Hope can help us find the courage to walk into a future where the loss is crystal clear and the good is, as of yet, not understandable. The disciples of Jesus knew all about crucifixion. They had seen more than one in their lifetime, but they couldn't imagine resurrection. They knew all about losing Jesus, but couldn't imagine what it would mean to have the Holy Spirit. There's a scene in the life of Jesus where Peter, John, and James are fishing in the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus appears and tells them to let down their nets one more time. When what appears to be a miracle of full nets happens, these men are astounded. Don't be afraid, Jesus tells them. And then he commands, come, follow me, and I will show you ... A totally different way of life. Don't be afraid, follow me, Jesus says. Now you may think I am referring to the first encounters of the disciples with Jesus, and I am, combining the passages found in Mark 1 and Mark 5. But I could just as easily be referring to John 21, one of the last encounters of the disciples with Jesus. There's the same thing. The disciples fishing on the Sea of Galilee, pointedly going back to their old way of life. There are the same empty nets. There is the same command of Jesus, cast your nets in a new way, the same miracle, the same astonishment, Peter scrambling out of the boat in order to prostrate himself. Does Peter remember Jesus' first words? Do not be afraid. Jesus prophesies over Peter a life that ends in imprisonment and martyrdom, and then says something that so many of us readers of John 21 overlook. Jesus says, follow me. There is a follow me invitation given at the beginning of the second half of our spiritual lives, just like there is one given at the first half. There is a follow me invitation given at the beginning of the vast unknown future. There's a follow me invitation given at the beginning of the biggest transitional period in human history. And every transitional period after that, including your own. Do not be afraid. Follow me, Jesus says. I'm Lowell Bliss, Christian environmental missionary and climate activist. Thank you for visiting the Liberator today.